Well, hello, everyone. I'm Jack Klieger, President and CEO of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's very special program, presented in recognition of Veterans Day this week. Ever since our founding 24 years ago, the museum's work has been animated by the voices of Holocaust survivors, who serve as our collective conscience and our call to action. Each survivor has their own unique story, but many did not begin to tell their stories until years after the war. The reasons people waited were varied. For some, the hurt was simply too deep. Others wanted to wait until their children were grown. Others didn't think the world would care. I'm deeply grateful that so many have now chosen to open up. And each survivor has a right to process their experiences in their own way. And the rest of us have a responsibility to respect those choices. The same is true of combat veterans, a group of people with very different experiences who nonetheless have had to wrestle with trauma and who have at times been able to learn from survivors. We're not here today to compare the experiences of survivors and veterans, but there is great meaning to be found in having dialogue across difference. And that's why we brought together three esteemed guests for a dialogue about their experiences as individuals and their perspectives on service, on survival, and on trauma. Fred Terna is a Holocaust survivor and painter living and working in Brooklyn, New York. He's 97 years young and a member of the museum's Speakers Bureau. U.S. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Mather is a Special Forces officer and Purple Heart recipient who has spent time serving in Iraq, Afghanistan, and South America over a 20-year military career. U.S. Colonel Jack Jacobs is a retired Army colonel who received a Medal of Honor for his service in Vietnam. Since retiring from the military, he has worked as a faculty member at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, an investment banker, and now as a military analyst for MSNBC. Fred, Patrick, and Jack, thank you all for being here. Before I pass things over to Jack, I'd like to mention to everyone watching that you should feel free to share questions and comments in the Zoom chat throughout the program. And there will be a Q&A period towards the end. Thank you and welcome. Jack?
Patrick, let me start with you. I decided that I was going to serve, but I wasn't going to go to West Point because I figured that the only people who go to West Point are those who want to be in the Army for 20 years. I was just going to do my bit, go in for 3 years and then get out. So I didn't want to go to West Point. In the end, I wound up staying for 20 years. It's really quite bizarre what irony there is. What motivated you to go to West Point?
I think it's a bit prosaic, but I came from a military family. My father had served, my grandfathers had served, most of the male family members in my family had served. And so I think, that was something that I saw as a viable path for me going forward. And I didn't really think whether or not I would serve for 20 years, although West Point certainly encourages that. But I got recruited to play lacrosse at West Point, and so I went up there. But that was just the pretext for me going to visit. The more meaningful reason was that when I went to West Point, I sensed an immediate sense of family and camaraderie amongst the cadets that I knew that I wanted to be a part of, and that wasn't something I had experienced before, and it was intoxicating in a lot of ways. And to see that, I just knew that I absolutely had to be a part of it, and so that sealed my decision for me as a young 18-year-old and trying to figure out what I was going to do next.
You get a lot of training from the time you're a young soldier or a young cadet through being a young lieutenant and so on. All kinds of training that's realistic, that tries to be realistic, and then you wind up in combat, and it's, in my view, it's nothing at all like the training. Tell us a little bit about your experiences in combat.
Well, I should say, I guess, to give an overview, I spent 2004 to 2005 in Iraq. I did the major invasion of Fallujah with the Marine Corps, serving as a part of that, not a primary effort, but a secondary effort to that. I then moved up to Mosul, Iraq, where I served with my brigade, trying to bring security to that region. Most searing of that was there was a suicide attack there that killed over 20 people that I was fortunately I lived through, but the people around me, most of the people around me did not, and I think just as the way it was set up, the way I was standing allowed me to live through it. And then that was my first real experience with death and my own mortality. And then I went on. I spent a couple weeks really thinking about that upon my return home, but it wasn't something that I actually felt fortunate in a weird way to have been part of that experience. And not that I felt fortunate to be part of the violence, but to be part of the community of people who had served. But I went on, I came home in 2005 and went to Special Forces selection. And then I spent 3 deployments in Afghanistan as a Special Forces detachment commander, where I led my team in, hundreds of patrols and, probably over 50 or 60 firefights, direct engagements with the enemy. And that was the period of time when I was directly in charge and responsible for the lives of my men and the people and the soldiers and service members that were with me. And that was the most searing, 2.5 years of my life, where it prompted me. I was involved in a lot of violence, a lot more than I thought I would be. And I had to make a lot of moral judgments and a lot of ethical decisions, oftentimes without having had the experience of thinking through those beforehand. And so I went through that 2.5 years, coming out of my last deployment in 2009. And that was when I began a period of reassessment based on the experiences that I had learned or had in Afghanistan, that caused me to really think about those, how I fit into the world, and then decisions we make and how we're all connected.
It sounds like the impact of being responsible for other people was far larger than the impact of just being an individual soldier and its effect on you. I mean, the way you tell it, it sounds like the more responsibility you have in an environment like that, the more difficult it becomes. Is that how you saw it? Do you think that's true?
Absolutely. Yes. In many ways, I determined over the course of my deployments that my life, while it was important and something I wanted to preserve, I felt more, I felt a stronger obligation to take care of my men and the people that I was responsible for.
How'd you get through that?
Most important to me was, well, before we deploy, we talk about the laws of land warfare. We talk about the rules of engagement. We talk about just war theory. We talk about all these things that are important, and that helps form your character. We also talk about the Army values, and what coalesces all that is the mission that we were given by our political decision makers. And then I wanted to acquit myself well in support of that mission, and I wanted to take care of the people that I was there. It was really the fact that I knew my leadership would take care of me, my men would take care of me, my trust in them, that I would take care of them. That was how I got through it, was that I put my trust in the service members I was with, my teammates, and they put the trust in me. And so that was what gave me faith to continue through all of those experiences that were most searing for me.
Fred, I know it's a completely different experience, and none of us, I mean, I've been in combat, and those who have been in uniform and been in combat understand exactly what Patrick is talking about. But Fred, you were in a completely different situation that had a great impact on your psyche, how you dealt with yourself and your environment, and how you dealt with things afterwards. Could you talk to us about all that, please?
You're trying to tell me events that go back 70 or 80 years? That is a lifetime. And what happened in between? How did I manage to get through all that? Now, I got into my first camp when I was not quite 18 years old. The reason was that I'm a Jew. And when living in Prague before the war, my family, as typical Prague Jewish family, lived the usual middle class life, very intellectual, very cultural, and very involved in the community. When I got in 1939, 38, when the Pact of Munich between Daladier and Chamberlain was made, essentially dismantling a fairly good democracy, namely Czechoslovakia. And 6 months later, we were occupied by Nazi Germany. And as a Jew, I was subject, I and the rest of the community, to all the Nazi laws persecuting Jews. What we did not know then is what the ends would be. That is, the conference that decided to kill all the Jews was formalized at a conference outside Berlin, Wannsee conference, that happened in January 20 something, in 1940. By then, I was in a camp. The camp was a quote unquote good one. Nobody got killed there. That happened somewhere else. Essentially, young people, a group that was picked by, and I'm not sure who picked it, they're largely college age students. I was the second youngest in that group, not quite 18. And that first camp was an education that continued throughout the rest of the years. Now, we were mostly hardworking, slave labor, building roads, working in forests, all that under the rule or under the command of a Gestapo officer. We were not allowed anything that is the rule was whatever isn't permitted is obligatory. Now I can give you details about each different camps. I was from October 5th, 1941 to liberation outside Landsberg in Bavaria was 3 years, 6 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. And I'm saying that not to be facetious, but somewhere to hint to you that each day was a difficult day and no 2 days were the same. When I was liberated, I weighed 50 kilos. And I was one of those shuffling skeletons of which most of you have seen pictures. Now, obviously, there is a lot of in-between events and feelings.
When did it become obvious to you that the whole...
Excuse me, I'm sorry. I hope you had all right, let me turn this off. So,
when did it become obvious to you after 39 that the whole objective was to destroy the entire Jewish community in Europe?
legally, officially at no time. As a practical matter, we didn't know what was going on. That is, the flow of information was minimal. There was obviously no official communication other than the edict of the Nazis. So the first thing that they did when after 1939 was, for instance, the family lost all possessions. My father lost his business. I was not allowed to go to school. So it's very, very gradually, but incessantly, our lives were diminished. The final solution, as spelled by the Nazis, we didn't know about. We just experienced it as a receiving end of it, as people were killed around us.
You know, when you're at the bottom of the food chain in a situation like you were, and when you're in combat, strategy doesn't matter to you very much. It's all a catastrophe from 1 minute to the next. It's all a crisis when you're at the bottom. And strategic objectives don't enter into it. What about your parents and the rest of your family?
They all perished. I'm the only survivor in the family. I say, if you think of your family gathering, whatever the occasion is, a wedding, somebody's important birthday. In my case, there's nobody. I'm the only one.
So what in your character, what in your background, what got you through all that?
I was a typical Central European family, and we had a certain set of standards of behavior. And I learned very, very quickly that what is important is how to live, what the values of life are. And that carried me through the entire war. That is, to the very end. The Nazis around us, and I don't want to describe details, you can read about them. We inmates remained civilized. We talked to each other in a polite way. We said, please and thank you, and listened to each other. That is, to speak, to behave like a human being was probably the strongest influence in my survival. Not mine only, but of the community at large.
I think that's true in just about every difficult situation. That structure, friendship, a sense of community goes a long way to taking you through extremely difficult periods. During all this time, clearly, there were times when you had to make some difficult choices, difficult decisions, moral judgments. Can you talk about those at all?
It was so very, very much part of the community that I didn't have to learn something. It was part of me, part of the group around me. We just lived a certain way and stayed a certain way. And that cohesion of being aware of being of a totally different world kept us going, kept me going.
You know, at the risk of commandeering this whole thing, there's a Medal of Honor recipient, now gone, named Tibor Rubin, a Jew from Budapest, and wound up in Mauthausen concentration camp. At the end of the war, he was 15 years old, and the camp was liberated by the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, who then moved on. And Ted said that he vowed that if he survived, and just surviving the camp, I'm telling you something you already know, didn't mean that you were going to survive. There's plenty yet to go afterwards. He said if he survived, he was going to come to the United States and become a GI Joe and pay the United States back for saving his life, which he did. He didn't speak any English. He spoke Hungarian and Yiddish. He lied his way into the army and found himself in Korea, where he had been recommended. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor 4 separate times. Finally got it 55 years after the fact, and I went to the ceremony in the White House. And the reason it had not been processed was that the leadership in his company threw away, said no Jew is ever going to get an award in my unit, and they threw all the recommendations away. But they were reconstructed by the soldiers he saved in his unit in Korea. And in a POW camp, he was in a POW camp, and after getting captured by the Chinese. But he said the same thing you did, Fred. It's structure. You got to treat each other with respect and treat each other as a friend, even though you don't know somebody. You know somebody's going to die tomorrow, And that's what got him through too. And it sounds like that's what got you through all those difficult years. Patrick, you were in a different circumstance in combat, but do the things that Fred was talking about, do they resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to be clear with everybody, I think the genesis of this was in early January. I came and saw Fred speak, part of the Speakers Bureau. And, as a young kid, as an adult, my whole life, I've always, for one reason or another, been attracted to, the Jewish people, culture, and traditions. It was always something that I was interested in, and took the opportunity to come witness when I could. And so I came, and before I came and saw, Fred, before I came and saw you speak, I had been going through about 10 years of recovery on my own from, what is diagnosed as PTSD, but what I characterize as moral injury. And because I don't experience my post-war life as, having maladaptive fear to what would otherwise be normal situations, but instead I'm accosted by, these feelings of guilt and shame uncontrollably most of the time, or a lot of the time. And I had to learn, how to deal with those before I could ever address them. And so I had largely turned the corner on a lot of that. And I had really, through the efforts of some pretty meaningful people in my life, had helped me process that. And so I was interested in what Fred, as a survivor, had to say. And again, I think it's important, for me anyways, to say that, not to compare these experiences, but I'm interested in how other people survived, and not only that, but how they thrived after trauma. And so I came and Fred, I heard you speak, and the thing that was so resonant to me was that you said, of all the questions, I should back up and say all the questions that people asked you, they took two forms, really. How did you survive during, and how did you survive after the war? And your answers were both resonant and instructive for me. Resonant because you said things that paralleled my experience. And that was when I realized that I had acted as civilly and as humanely as I possibly could, despite the conditions I was in. That's when I started to turn the corner and have hope that I was not a person, I was not the feelings that I had, that I was not a shameful person because I felt shame. And I was able to start resolving and dissipating those feelings that were such a large part of my life. And then the other thing you said, Fred, which was fascinating to me because it was another part of my experience, was you said that you remained committed to your community upon your return, and that you tried to be as involved as you could, and you didn't isolate yourself from your community. And I spent a number of years doing just that, isolating myself from my community. And it was only after the realization that I needed to stay committed to my community. In a way, it was one of the things that helped me recover, was that I could, then continue to contribute something despite these feelings that I was having that are often uncontrollable. And I should say for everybody that I think, Fred, when I wrote you your letter in saying I had these similar experiences interpersonally, I was very careful to say that I'm a combat veteran. So I was both the subject of violence, but also the object of violence. And being the object of violence, I had to make some very difficult moral decision-making. And even when I was inflicting violence on others, I was still being as civil as I could while doing that, and while managing the competing values and ethics, my personal morality, my obligations to my community and my men in the country. And so that was a lot to integrate, but I think that was different, and I wanted to be very delicate about that when I talked to you. And so I think that's been important for me to remember as I've listened to you speak and heard about your experience.
You know, armed combat is just almost an endless stream of situations in which you have to make continuous moral judgments. And even if you've made them, you got to make them again. Can you talk in a little bit more detail about some of those situations, how you dealt with them and how you dealt with them afterwards, if you did?
Yes. You know, you asked me this question earlier, and I wanted to think about it, you know, before I talked about it. Essentially, a lot of the questions, the moral judgments I had to make essentially involved, you know, the things that were most difficult, I should say the things that were most difficult for me were not, and, you know, forgive me for my bluntness, but this is the experiences. It was not killing the enemy. That was something that fit within the framework of what I had been trained for and had been psychologically trained for, not just physically trained for. And I had, so when that happened and when I had to do that, that was something that I was more or less comfortable with. I did get concerned when I started to become desensitized to it. After it took, you know, after an accumulation of events, I started to be concerned there. But that was something that I could deal with separately, I knew. The most challenging aspects were when I had to make events, most challenging events were when I had to make choices to take the life of people that I otherwise would never have done in any other circumstance, because I felt that it was the most moral thing to do given my obligation to protect my men. And I always say men because I never served with women. So just for everybody's knowledge, that's why I say that. And I think, you know, in my training, we talked about this concept of proportionality and, you know, using the amount of violence that is necessary to achieve your military objective, but not going so far as to be disproportional. And then, so to be very, very clear about the choices I had to make, which were how proportional, how much is one of my men's lives worth? For how many people am I willing to try to destroy to save his life or to save my life or to save all of our lives? And that was a decision that I had to make. That was, I made that repeatedly. And I thought my judgment was good, was good. I made good judgment, and I would make the decisions again today. That said, it doesn't mean that they weren't incredibly painful and decisions that I would be loath to make again.
But you know people in combat who didn't go through that calculus, or who did go through that calculus and made the wrong decision. We all know people like that. And sometimes, even today, I'm talking about 50 some odd years after the fact, I get most overwrought, not about the environment in which I found myself, not about the decisions that I had to make and made, but about the decisions others made when I think they made the immoral decision, and they did it anyway. I can't, 55 years after the fact, it just doesn't compute in my mind. And I don't know if the same thing that makes it difficult for me, it probably makes it difficult for you too.
It does. And that's the thing that holds me together there is I realize that I believe morality is usually, morality can be discerned differently in different individuals. And so I cling to the idea that everybody is doing the best they can in the circumstances that they have, and that sometimes we fall short. And I hope to give, you know, I hope to give some forgiveness for people who maybe would have made different decisions than I would have made.
Fred, I want to talk a little bit about after the fact. Having gone through an extremely difficult period, having survived, I mean, was there any feeling of survivor's guilt? Did it take you a while to be able to talk about your experience in the camps? Could you talk about that for us?
Well, survivor's guilt was there all the time. Why did I survive? And so many who were so much more humane, more educated, more active, did not survive. And I'm thinking of all the great teachers around me none of them survived. How much community people. I might think my grandmother, who was a kind of a chairperson of a large sisterhood. And what did she do? Her lifetime, the aim was then, before 1939, to feed the sick, to clothe the poor, to be an active and positive member of the community. All these are gone, and I cannot live up to them. I can remember them and continue to live by their values. Now you ask, how did I manage afterwards? And the first year or two, I was still physically recovering and trying to put my body into functioning mode, which I succeeded. Not too well, but I did. Well, I did all right. I'm still around.
I think you did a spectacular job. I
Well,
got to know your secret.
Well, we did one brilliant thing in my life. I picked the right parents. The rest was luck. Yes, it took a long time to deal with the past. That is, when we returned, we being that handful of survivors in that particular camp at that time in Bavaria, it took us a long, long time to be listened to be accepted. When I returned to Prague, the first thing I got was rejection. Well, you must have been a particular scoundrel to have survived. And it took the world about 20 years, by and large, to deal with what happened. And my cutoff date, seen historically, was the Eichmann trial. Before that, a few handful of books had been written, a few notes. There was hardly any record of it. It is then that suddenly the world understood that something happened that has to be dealt with. And that was really the 1950s, that is more or less the 1950s, that the books were written, that records were collected. And for me, it was an awareness that this is the world I'm living in, and I can deal with it as well as I can. It was not easy emotionally. That is, I was not looked at as a person who happens to be alive after the war, I didn't realize that I had become a refugee, that I had
Is it just me? Did we lose Fred? Did we lose his video?
I've lost it as well.
Okay.
It's like Fred is frozen. I'll work on that with him, but feel
Okay.
free to carry on.
Well, we'll be able to come back to it. Let me ask you this, Patrick. How long did it take you to start talking about your experiences to anybody?
I think it was about 2 years before I decided that I wanted to attempt to talk about them. I found myself I was living in North Carolina at the time, and it was about 2.5 years after I'd returned home. And I had lost about 35 pounds. I was not eating anymore. Was kind of locked into my house. I was still working, but that was the only thing I was leaving my house for. And I was getting ready to move to Washington, D.C. for a new job. And I was laying on the kitchen floor, and I realized, well, something was wrong, and I needed help. And
I mean, did you suspect that that's what it was? I mean,
oh yeah, very
Yeah.
much so. I did. And I was laying on my kitchen floor, and I just said, okay, I either get up and do something and try to get better, because this is the life I have, or I just give up. And I think giving up, I probably knew where that was going to go. And so I decided that I was just going to get up and put one foot in front of the other and find some help. Fortunately, I found a friend, and who introduced me to someone that was, incredibly meaningful in my life. He who's now passed away, Dr. Simon Oster, who was a psychiatrist and physician in Washington, D.C., and who incidentally was an Orthodox Jew, and I think which formed a lot of how he, talked to me about my experiences and how he made sense of those. And he was 50 years older than me, so we couldn't have come from different backgrounds. He was never had been in the military setting, he would never have had the Constitution for it, and he enjoyed nothing more than sitting there listening to me talk. And so it was about probably 3 years of talking to him before I was able to confront some of the experiences that were most challenging for me.
Other than Dr. Ulster, who else looms large in your life, either before putting on the uniform, well, and after as well, both times? Because we all look back when somebody says, well, who meant the most to you? Who really had an impact on you? You say, well, nobody. No, it was this guy. No, it was also this other person, and she did too. Give it enough time, you come up with dozens of people. But who helped you the most, both before putting the uniform on and afterwards?
Before, there was a very good family friend of mine who was, my parents played bridge when I was growing up, and I joined. I would sometimes play with them. And one of the other couples that came to our house to play bridge was a World War II veteran and Korean War veteran. And
we were a poker and pinochle family.
We didn't play poker, but we also did pinochle too. We played them all. So this gentleman was 60 plus years older than me, and I ended up becoming very good friends with him over my lifetime. And before I went to Iraq the first time, he was the only person that gave it to me very real and very succinctly and very briefly. And as I was leaving, it's like a great movie scene. As I was leaving, he pulls me aside and he said, listen, war is dirty and it's mean and it's ugly. Do everything you can to come home and then figure it out afterwards. And I appreciated him telling me that, because that sort of framed me going in, because you get a lot of, you see movies as a kid growing up and none of it really matches reality, but that was about as real as he could have given it to me, I think. Recognizing that you just can't explain it to somebody if they haven't been there. And then,
before you go on to other people, it reminds me of an observation by John Stuart Mill. You mentioned earlier about just war and suggested, I suppose, Augustine and Aquinas and so on. But somebody don't necessarily want to quote John Stuart Mill, but he wrote something that pertains to everybody who's going into a situation like you're talking about, especially when you're grabbed just before. He said, war is a terrible thing. War is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things. A man for whom nothing is more important than his own safety is a miserable creature who is made free and kept free by better men than he. And I think all of us were pulled aside at one point or another and told something like that. And being wised up before you go in helped me as well. But I interrupted, and there are lots of other people who made you what you are today.
No, there are, and I'll talk about them. And I think, I want to qualify a question you asked me earlier, which was what helped me survive. And I think you helped me kind of answer that question a little bit. But the thing that kept me going because there did come a day when I decided I was done. I did not want to fight anymore. I was over the violence. I did not want to participate. I no longer believed in it, and I was not supporting of it. But that was the very real fact that I had people relying on me. And that is what kept me going when I decided I was done. And that was how I survived, and interestingly enough, you ask me now, who was most important to me after coming home. And, beyond Simon, it was the community of people. I think we heal within our community. I think we heal. And by that, I don't just mean our family, although those are the ones that are very important to us. But there was a family that was very important to me when I came home. It's a group of friends, and they took me into their home and had me to dinner once a week and gave me a safe place to talk. And I think that was, I didn't know it at the time, but that was creating a sense of safety for me, where I could tell stories that I was afraid were going to hurt other people, because the stories are horrific, and a lot of people don't want to hear that, and you don't want to horrify other people.
You know, it's funny you should mention that. I've thought about that a lot. What's the difference between somebody who's in the service, who seems to be perfectly okay, and then out of the service, everything goes to pieces? And I think about my father, who served in the Second World War, when we had 20 million people under arms. I grew up in the projects in New York City. Everybody in every household in my building had contributed to the war effort. So, but it's not like that now. And now we have an all volunteer force. You're in a small community inside the military. You rely on them, they rely on you. You take care of them, they take care of you. And then you're out and you're on your own. There's nobody with the experience you've had. And you feel all alone and with nobody to assist you. And I think that disconnect contributes greatly to post-traumatic stress. It exacerbates the experience that you have because you're around nobody with the same experience. I think that I believe in universal service, and we've all had the same rotten experience.
I do too. I firmly believe that PTSD has its individual manifestations with respect to, changed biology, but I believe strongly that a lot of that can be alleviated through our community of people who are willing to listen and to be present with the experiences that you had and to give you a place to tell those stories. And so I was incredibly grateful that I learned that there were people who were interested, and I learned how to identify those people. But you're right. And today I think there's fragmentation in today's society, and there is, it's very easy to be disconnected from what we've asked of our service members, and also not just our service members, but many other communities that have been traumatized by many other things, to include, Holocaust survivors in the Jewish community and the other communities up through modern day today that have had those. And society is incredibly important to that process.
Well, it was Ben Franklin who wrote just before the revolution, we either hang together or we will surely hang separately. Ari, did we get Fred back?
Fred is trying to log back on. He may be calling in via phone in a moment, but we could begin if you feel it's the right time, we could begin some of the audience questions, and we'll hope that Fred can.
Yeah, that'd be a great thing to do. Yeah, why don't we start some questions?
Well, thank you both for this conversation thus far. Patrick, there was a question for you actually for you and Fred, but with different. Did you see acts of morality in the enemy, and how did you think about the moral judgments that people on the other side of the battlefield might have had to make?
What's interesting is I was never really angry at the enemy for fighting me and trying to kill me. I was not. I recognized, and I know that may be strange for people to hear, and even for my friends who also served in many ways. I thought that they were born where they were and were trained the way they were and socialized the way they were, and they were put in a position to make a choice. And I didn't see a whole lot of difference, objectively speaking, about I was on the battlefield and so were they. And so I did, now did I see, so in that moment when I was fighting them, I didn't really think about it a lot. Now, I saw the enemy do lots of things that were absolutely horrible and despicable, and to include torture and sexual assaults and mass killing. And I saw that, witnessed it, and regularly. And so, yeah, I think that, making a personal moral choice, those were things that I found to be wicked and despicable. But on the battlefield, as I was fighting, I thought that person was just doing what they were trying to do. And fortunately, I came out on top.
I'm struck by your use of the term "the enemy," and it was in the question, but also in response to you using it before. It's sort of dehumanizing and maybe necessary. Jack, is that when you were on the battlefield, is that how you referred, is that how you're taught to think about the people you're fighting against? And it looks like Fred is logging back on. This is his wife with us. Hi,
Um,
welcome back. Brad, we just need you to unmute. There should be that microphone symbol on your screen in the corner. Hopefully Fred will be able to unmute. There we go.
Hello?
No, you want to be like,
We can hear you again.
All right. So you want me?
let me get the tab.
so
So Jack, I was wondering about your experience in war and how you were taught to think about the enemy.
Well, you're never taught to hate the enemy. You are taught to hate what he does. It's really kind of interesting. I had the same dispassionate view of the enemy as probably the enemy did of me. I mean, we're taught in the infantry, we're taught to close with or kill or capture the enemy, and use whatever means we can in order to do that. And when the battle is over, you just look forlornly at the other kids who didn't make it, who were on the other side. I went back to Vietnam 46 years after I'd been there, and the government of Vietnam found the enemy commander who was opposed to me on the day of my action in 1968. He was living next door to a bicycle repair shop not far from where we had fought. And here are two guys who tried desperately to kill each other 46 years before. And we sat down and had a gentlemanly and professional discussion about the meeting, about the engagement. And my view of the enemy had not changed. We were out there to complete the mission and to come back alive if we could, and bring our men back alive if we could, but to complete the mission in any case. And it had nothing at all to do with the personality of the person on the other side of the rifle.
Thank you. Fred, welcome back.
Thank you, thank you. I don't know what happened.
We carried on without you, but we're glad to have you here again. And there was an audience member who asked a question about whether each of you saw acts of morality in the enemy. Did you feel that your perpetrators during the Holocaust ever showed small moments of moral judgment that you respected or at least recognized?
Since the Nazis I dealt with were largely members of the SS and the Gestapo, there were none that I noticed even a hint of a reluctance or moral scruple. If it was there, I did not notice any.
You know, we were talking earlier, Fred. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about who helped you during the war, not just physically, but emotionally, if anybody. Who did you rely on? And who helped you afterwards?
During the war, essentially, the culture I lived in supported me. That is, speaking the truth, being forthright, being polite, remain humane. And I think that was the main ingredient. If there were people around me who were potentially kind to me, there was hardly ever the occasion. That is, I moved within the Gestapo, the SS, and their guards. Those guards were not picked for being nice and humane. They were picked to be as nasty as can be. So if they did feel something, it sure should not show.
It's amazing what people can do to other people. Ari, did you have any other questions for us?
Yeah, Fred, one audience member is asking about Holocaust denial. Given the depth of the pain that you experienced in losing your family, how do you deal with the fact that there are people out there who deny your experience?
I compare them to the flat earth people. But the same kind of mentality, denying reality. And nothing I can do about it except trying to show them, to point at books, at movies, at records. That is, today there are libraries of what happened about it. it is in fact that this may be the moment for me to say thank you to the world that is, after 20 years of silence, very gradually, slowly, there were courses on the shore, as the shore being, well, members of the museum know the word, that the courses on the Holocaust, not just here and there isn't really a larger or more important place of learning where you cannot learn about it. Today, there isn't a university that doesn't have a department of social activity that will not include a course on the Holocaust. So today, from Lima to New Zealand, there isn't a college, a university that does not teach about the Holocaust. And that gives me a certain satisfaction that we survivors who try to tell our stories finally have an audience. That is, that audience, you guys, you people watching this transmission are part of the chain of what we wanted to be, that is, tell our memories, transmit our memories, and you are doing a good job. That is, we are being listened to. Those who perished wanted to have one thing more than anything else. Don't forget me, remember my life. And that makes me feel quite good. That is, we have succeeded in something and we are working on it. And I'm sort of handing it over to you people to keep doing this.
Yeah, but we have to constantly remind ourselves that we have to redouble our efforts to make sure that we do not forget, because it's easy for time to dissipate the truth. I'm reminded of a Mark Twain observation. He said, when I was young, I could remember everything, whether it had happened or not. And when I got older, the only thing I could remember is the stuff that didn't happen. We need to make sure that we work hard so that succeeding generations remember what happened.
Thank you. And it's who we are as a museum and why we exist and why the work will never end. So wholeheartedly. Fred, there's another question for you, which is many Holocaust survivors had experienced trauma around men in uniform because it was people in uniform who perpetrated crimes against them. And some survivors carried that forward in their interactions with police and soldiers later on in life. Is that true to your experience, and how have you felt about men in uniform?
Our son will tell you that when I get into a situation, suddenly somebody appears in a uniform, no matter what, fireman, policeman, I freeze. Somewhere there is an automatic reaction, and I feel suddenly, I catch myself, and I said, wait a minute, this is just a policeman doing his job. And I still react to it. I react to, there may be other things that make me react to the Shoah, and I'm not sure what they are or when they come, but they come out of left field. Suddenly, a word is said, a situation arises, and wow, back I am in a camp. And I catch myself and say, wait a minute, I'm here in Brooklyn, things are all right. But it still is there all the time. That is, the Shoah is present at all times. All that I've learned is to live with it.
Patrick, what's it like for you to hear Fred's answer to that question?
Can't hear you.
I think it makes sense. In a way, I was a bit nervous writing to Fred because, I didn't want to compare what I went through to what he went through. And I don't think that's an apt comparison. And I don't think it's fair. I think what was striking to me was that there seems to be a common thread of humanity. So to hear him say, Fred, to hear you say that you have these responses to men in uniform, I understand that, and that makes sense because I have my own responses to environmental things that happen around me, and I certainly take no offense to that by any means. And I think it probably makes total sense. For me, the thing about coming to hear Fred speak was that it was there was this common sense of, even though I was a soldier who went through what I went through, here's a Holocaust survivor who went through what he went through, completely different experiences, not only generationally but culturally and in every other way, yet how he spoke of his recovery and how he talks about living with it after the fact, and then thriving despite what happened has been similar to my experience. And I think that was what was most striking to me and what prompted this original discussion.
I think to sum up what you both said, I think they are similar, if not identical. Trauma is the cause and humanity is the cure.
Yeah, that's what I've been saying the whole time is, I think one of the questions is, what do we hope for the future? And my hope for the future is that veterans, survivors of the Shoah, of communities that have been traumatized, people that have been traumatized, that they have an opportunity to speak about it. And I think because the humanity is what heals.
And you're quite right. And we all have a part to play. It was Hillel who said, if not you, who? And if not now, when?
That's right.
It's us, and now's the time.
That's right.
Ari?
We'll end in a moment, but I want to give Fred an opportunity to tell us a little bit about his art, which is right there next to him, and I know is part of how he's experienced this.
Talk to me.
Yeah, Fred, can you? I know you mentioned that piece of art is connected to your experience in the Holocaust. What role has art played for you?
Well, it didn't start until much later, obviously. During the Holocaust, there was none of it. And even afterwards, it took a long time before I acquired the materials and eventually the skills. The reason I became an artist is a young lady whom I knew before the war, among the survivors in Prague of marriageable age, well, a handful of men, a handful of ladies, and I married one of them, a wonderful person who unfortunately was very, very much affected by the war. She and her sisters were the only survivors in their big, big families, and one of them died by suicide. The other one really let herself go to a point where she couldn't function. That is, she was suicidal, and I had to take care of her. I didn't have to take care. I got married to her with the understanding that, well, this is it. And how does one make a living? I had no trade. I had no skills. I had no detailed information. I've learned a lot since then. But eventually I had to do something that would make me bring in some money. And I became an artist. It allowed me to do something that I enjoyed and kept me in the house. That is, I was there at all the critical moments, not all of them, but most of them. So I became an artist because that was my way of dealing with the family situation and the practical situation. And over the years, I developed as an artist, being thinking, learning, and I'm still in that mode. You'll not find me in front of the television. You will find me in front of a book or trying to learn something. That is, to be active, to be involved, to learn how to paint and to use painting as well as I can to allow my feelings to end up on a canvas. If something bothers me, it goes onto a canvas. Good canvas or bad canvas? Who am I to judge that? But some people like my artwork and try to acquire it. Luckily for me, not because I'm a great painter, far from it. to me, painting is an outlet. It is, I very irreverently call it a throwaway place, getting rid of stuff. The idea of what happened is constantly there. The mind keeps working, and the expression that I find easiest is on a canvas. And to read the canvas, I never illustrate, by the way. I cannot do that. I know that it has been done in the past and done quite well. I cannot do it. I paint feelings, I paint attitudes, I paint an experience that is visual. If you know my paintings, you can read them. If not, just trying to have a painting. Very fortunately, I'm still able to produce them. What is my next painting going to be like? I don't know. I'll keep working on it. As I keep feeling, I'm pouring out on the canvas. Technically, I'm a good painter, technically. Was it art? Oh, don't ask me. I'm not the one to judge on that.
Thank you. Well, it's a beautiful note to end on. Fred, we're all excited to see your next painting, which I hope maybe will end up on your website. I just put it in the chat so that people can see a little bit more of your work. But on behalf of the museum, I want to thank everyone for tuning in. And I really want to thank Fred, Jack, and Patrick for sharing their time with us. And Fred is showing us now that painting, which is complete and which is, you mentioned about Noah, right, Fred?
Yes.
So I want to thank everyone for tuning in. We will send out a recording of this program tomorrow to everyone who registered, and it will go on the museum's YouTube channel and blog as well. And we host 2 programs plus per week. We hope if you joined us today and found this meaningful that you'll subscribe to our mailing list and check out some of our other programs at the museum's website, mjhnyc.org. And we also ask for donations to support our work. Everything that we do is made possible by community members like you. So thank you for standing with us and tuning in as we seek to remember the history and legacy of the Holocaust. And Patrick, Jack, and Fred, I hope you all have a peaceful and safe evening.
Thanks,
Thank
Mark.
you. We had a grand time. Thanks for including us.
Bye, everyone.